What would justice look like if there were no prisons, no executions, just poetry, cattle, and ancient memory? Would that world feel kinder or just confusing? Tell us in the comments. In the misty green hills of early medieval Ireland, where sheep wandered freely through narrow stone paths and the air smelled faintly of turf smoke and wet heather, a quiet kind of law reigned. It wasn't the dramatic sort of justice filled with clanging swords and royal decrees like you'd find in Norman courts or Roman tribunals. No, this was something older, gentler in some ways and more peculiar in others. It was the Brehon law, named after the Brehons, learned judges who committed centuries of oral tradition to memory. The Brehon Code governed Irish society for over 1,000 years. It was a system of laws not written by kings but preserved by poets, scholars, and legal experts who lived quietly among the people. Their law wasn't about punishment in the modern sense. It was about restoration, compensation, and equilibrium. And yet, nestled within this calm and almost community-driven form of justice, there were some very curious consequences for wrongdoers. The Brehons weren't enforcers, they carried no swords, wore no official robes, and held no seats of power. Instead, they were mediators and interpreters of an ancient, mostly unwritten code. Their role was not to hand down punishment, but to advise, to interpret the law and suggest the proper compensation for wrongs. Think of them like human law books, with a memory so strong they could recall hundreds of detailed precedents across generations. Brehons were often trained from childhood in bardic schools where they memorized verse upon verse of legal poetry. Yes, legal poetry. Much of Brehon law was recorded in metrical form, making it easier to memorize and pass on. Legal disputes were sometimes decided with references to poetic stanzas that were several centuries old. They didn't sit in courtrooms. Rather, they gathered in open fields or under the shade of sacred trees and listened to the facts as told by the injured party. Then, drawing on memory, tradition, and a sense of fairness, they would recommend a judgment. That judgment often came in the form of a fine or eiraic, a payment, usually in cattle or silver, that aimed to restore social harmony. One of the first things you'll notice about the Brehon system is what it didn't have. There were no prisons, no gallows, no public flogging, no branding with hot irons. In fact, many offences that in other parts of medieval Europe would result in disfigurement or death were handled in Ireland with compensation. If you insulted someone, you might owe a sower cane an honour price fine. If you injured someone's hand and they could no longer weave or hold a plough, you'd be required to provide for them or compensate for their lost income. The idea wasn't to make people suffer for breaking the law. It was to restore the balance that had been disturbed. But here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes, in the process of restoring balance, the punishments became peculiar. Let's say you were caught stealing honey from your neighbour's beehives. Under Brehon law, bees were considered intelligent creatures and had their own legal status. If you disturbed a hive, the bees could take vengeance, and so could the law. Punishment didn't come in the form of physical pain, but precise compensation. You might be required to provide a replacement hive. Or if the bees had stung someone in the process of the theft, you'd owe restitution not only to the owner, but in some poetic interpretations, to the bees themselves. Now imagine a tavern dispute. You and another farmer get into an argument over a poorly played harp tune. Words turn to shoves, and before you know it, someone's tooth is knocked out. The Brehon Code had an exact compensation scale for this. A front tooth carried more value than a molar, especially if the injured person was a bard or speaker. In fact, the loss of a tooth that affected speech had a much higher eiraic, as it might end someone's career as an orator. If you were unable to pay in cattle or goods, you might have to offer land or, in some cases, serve the person you injured. This form of justice was not about punishing you for the sake of vengeance. It was about preserving the social fabric. No one could afford chaos in a community where survival was communal. And then there was air, or legal satire. Imagine you're caught cheating in a barley deal. You give someone a sack of wet grain, hoping they won't notice until they get home. Instead of facing prison, you might face something worse, a professional poet composing a verse about your dishonesty and performing it at the next gathering. In early Irish society, satire was feared more than physical punishment. A sharp verse could damage your reputation, your honor price, and your family's standing for generations. In some legal tracts, it suggested that a powerful enough satire could even cause physical blemishes, boils, or bad luck through the sheer power of words. Being publicly ridiculed by a bard was not just embarrassing, it was legally and socially damaging. And unlike prisons, which could be forgotten, verses travelled. One famous legal text suggests that the punishment for falsely accusing someone was being forced to walk through a village with your clothes inside out and your shoes on the wrong feet, while a child beat a drum behind you. There was no permanent injury, but the memory lingered. Animals had personhood in some parts of the Brehon Code. Cows, in particular, were central to Irish life, not just as livestock, but as currency and legal markers. Most fines were calculated in cumals, a unit originally meaning the value of a female slave, but later equating to about 3 cows. If your cow wandered into someone else's field and trampled their garden, you could be required to pay damages or provide milk from your cow to their family for a set period of time. If you killed someone's pig, you owed a pig, and not just any pig, a pig of equivalent size, health, and breed. If that pig was a favorite or trained in any special way, some pigs were surprisingly well behaved, the fine could increase. There are also records of cooking pots being cause for legal disputes. If you borrowed a cauldron and returned it with a dent, the injured party could demand either a replacement or the repair, plus compensation for inconvenience. Cauldrons were rare and expensive. Losing one could mean no warm meals for a week. What makes the Brehon Code feel so different from modern legal systems is how much it relied on memory and social trust. There were no paper contracts in most cases. Agreements were made aloud, in front of witnesses, and remembered. Brehons would recall previous judgments from decades ago. Entire families were expected to remember legal traditions. People lived in a world where memory was law and law was story. This oral transmission gave Brehon law a flexibility that written law often lacks, but it also meant your standing in society mattered deeply. If you were known to have violated someone's cattle enclosure, that memory followed you. And if you were a repeat offender, you might not be punished physically, but your honor price would fall, meaning your life, legally, was worth less. That had deep consequences in a system where value was measured in cows, land, and standing. So why did the Brehon system develop such specific, sometimes strange-seeming punishments? Because Ireland, in the early medieval period, was made of tightly knit kin groups, not centralized kingdoms. Conflict between clans could lead to blood feuds, and blood feuds threatened everyone. Brehon law existed to prevent violence by providing structure, by turning injury into obligation, insult into restitution, and theft into service. Every cow had value, every word had weight, and every mistake had a price, but not always a painful one. The Brehon Code may seem odd to us now, but in its peculiar punishments, its tooth valuations, satire penalties, and poetic judgments, it reveals a society deeply concerned with balance, honor, and peaceful resolution. And it leaves us with a curious thought. If our modern world valued harmony over punishment, what would justice look like today? The Brehon Code, despite its reputation for kindness and compromise, could be unexpectedly creative in its approach to justice. And while many laws today are structured around deterrence or state power, the Brehon laws were about social equilibrium, a fine-tuned attempt to keep the peace among neighbors who quite literally couldn't afford to go to war every time someone's goat wandered across a fence line. Let's walk quietly into some of the real cases recorded or referenced in the Brehon legal tradition, cases involving broken oaths, accidental deaths, injured poets, and even nose injuries caused by insults. Each one tells us something about the values of the time and how justice was both strange and surprisingly specific. In a quiet village nestled along a bend in the River Shannon, a weaver named Finnebear had spent weeks preparing a special batch of indigo dye. This dye was rare, extracted painstakingly from imported woad plants, and fermented for weeks in buried earthen pots. When the young apprentice from a neighboring household wandered too close, tripped on a tool, and toppled the entire container into the river, the village erupted, not in violence but in concern. The case was brought before a local Brehon. The apprentice was a minor and hadn't meant to cause harm, but the damage was real. Indigo dye like this could not be replaced easily, and so the judgment was made. The boy's family would owe Finnebear 1.5 cumols, the equivalent of about 4.5 cows, or its value in goods and service. More interestingly, they were also required to gift her 1 new spinning wheel and 12 spools of wool within the season. Why? Because the Brehon believed that by giving her materials for weaving, she would regain not only her losses, but her dignity and livelihood. It wasn't punishment for its own sake, it was repair. Some infractions were more personal and even a little ridiculous. In a rural dispute referenced in the Brehon Code, a tract on injuries, a man accused another of pinching his nose so hard that it caused bleeding and dishonor. The incident reportedly took place during a drunken argument at the edge of a cattle market over whether one man's ox had the right lineage. Nose injuries, it turns out, were meticulously categorized in Brehon law. Was the injury permanent? Did it cause visible swelling? Did the pinch result in bleeding that embarrassed the man in public? The answers to each of these questions determined the value of the compensation. In this case, since the bleeding had occurred publicly, it was not merely a matter of injury but of insult. The judgment: the offending man was required to pay 2 cows and provide a free meal to the entire market gathering the following month. The meal was both symbolic and social. It gave the victim a chance to reclaim his honor and gave the offender a chance to demonstrate contrition. Everyone remembered the meal. Few remembered the pinch. One of the more haunting cases comes from an old legal manuscript involving 2 brothers who went out to gather peat from a marsh. One, slipping on the slick ground, accidentally knocked the other into a bog hole. The brother sank quickly. Though the survivor tried to pull him out, he failed. The death was ruled accidental. Even so, Brehon law did not let grief alone settle the matter. The surviving brother was responsible for ereis, a form of blood money. In this case, he was required to compensate the family, his own, by giving up a portion of his land and providing for the dead man's children until they reached age 16. This wasn't seen as cruel. It was an acknowledgement that even accidental deaths had consequences. You owed the community the labor and care lost with the departed life. It also ensured that the children of the deceased were not left vulnerable, a community-oriented approach to tragedy. Poets in medieval Irish society had extraordinary legal protection. Their tongues were sharper than swords, and their words were feared, admired, and codified. One story tells of a bard named Setash, who, while walking from one clan's estate to another, tripped on a stone left in the road by a careless servant. He fell and injured his ankle, leaving him unable to perform at a gathering where he had been paid to recite a celebratory verse. This injury disrupted not only his livelihood, but also his honor, and according to the law, his client's celebration. The Brehon ruled that the household responsible for the road was to provide Setak with full compensation, 1 pig, 1 cloak, and 2 months' worth of food and lodging while he healed. Additionally, they were to host a feast once he recovered, allowing him to perform again and regain his standing. The punishment wasn't about the fall, it was about restoration of voice and reputation. Honor wasn't just personal, it was contractual. Hospitality was sacred in early Irish society. Violating it brought shame beyond measure. One such violation involved a host who watered down mead served to a noble guest. Though not a crime by modern standards, in medieval Ireland this was a deep insult. The guest, feeling slighted, brought the matter before a local Brehon. The decision? The host was required to invite the same guest back within a month, and this time serve unwatered mead along with a gift of a fine cloak and silver cup. Furthermore, a public apology had to be issued, accompanied by a short satirical verse composed by a neutral bard, mocking the original mead crime, but gently. This case shows how public performance, both apology and verse, played a role in rebalancing reputation. One especially odd case involves a goat, a fence, and a garden full of sacred herbs. A farmer built his enclosure using uneven stakes, leaving enough space at the bottom for a goat to squeeze through. The goat entered a neighbor's garden, devoured half the herbs used by a local healer, and trampled several ceremonial plants considered sacred in local Druidic tradition. Here the law took an unusual turn. The farmer, who had built the fence, was held responsible, not the goat. The compensation included 2 goats in return of similar age and health, a small plot of grazing land granted to the healer until new herbs could be grown, and finally a blessing from the healer to restore harmony to the land. The Brehon's ruling wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. The land had been offended, and the act of healing it was seen as essential. One last curious tale comes from a story referenced in the Senchus Moor, involving a disagreement over whether a certain cow belonged to one farmer or another. No written contracts existed, there were no brands, and both men claimed the same beast. The Brehon, perhaps tired or amused, ruled that the cow should decide. The 2 men stood apart and called to the animal. The cow turned, walked toward one of them, and began licking his hands. The ruling: let the tongue of the cow settle the truth, as the tongues of men may lie. While poetic, this kind of ruling underscored something vital: trust in observation, behavior, and what today might be called common sense. And in a society where words mattered more than weapons, the cow's decision carried the weight of law. If you're still awake, or gently drifting off, here's a final observation to rest your thoughts on. These peculiar punishments weren't arbitrary. They were designed to prevent escalation. The Brehon Code offered peaceful alternatives in a world where a single insult could ignite generations of vengeance. Instead of prisons, they offered poetry. Instead of wounds, they offered meals. Instead of broken families, they tried to offer repair. It's boring history, yes, but it's beautiful in its own peculiar way. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the low hum of bees in an Irish summer, the distant splash of oars on a reed-fringed lake, or the whisper of voices trading news along a winding dirt path. For centuries, these sounds were the backdrop to justice in Ireland, a justice carried not in courtrooms or dungeons, but in stories, in memory, in community. But nothing in history remains untouched forever, not even the Brehons. In this final section, we trace how this deeply unique legal tradition began to unravel, not in sudden collapse, but through centuries of erosion, as waves of conquest, religious change, and foreign law reshaped the island's moral landscape. And we'll see how, even in its fading, the Brehon tradition left marks, quiet, stubborn marks, on the shape of Irish culture and law today. The earliest tremors of decline came not from within, but from abroad. When the Anglo-Norman invasion began in the late 12th century, it brought with it a very different idea of law, one based on royal authority, written records, centralized enforcement, and a state's claim to sole justice. The Normans were baffled by the Brehon system. To them, it seemed chaotic, law without kings, courts without prisons, judgments without corporal punishment, compensation instead of control, cows instead of chains. To a feudal mind, it was unthinkable, but for all their confusion, the invaders didn't erase the Brehon system overnight. In fact, for centuries after the Norman arrival, large parts of Ireland, especially the western and northern regions, continued to follow their traditional laws. Anglo-Norman and Gaelic Irish societies existed side by side, often uneasily, with two legal systems working in parallel. Historians refer to this era as the time of dual laws. In English-controlled regions known as the Pale, Norman law dominated. Outside it, in the wild Irish countryside, the Brehons still whispered judgments under ancient trees. But as centuries passed, the Crown's grip tightened. The Statutes of Kilkenny, 1366, for example, explicitly forbade English subjects from adopting Irish customs, especially Brehon law. Marrying an Irish person speaking Gaelic or consulting a Brehon could be punished severely. The English saw Irish customs as a threat to authority, and the legal tradition was one of its deepest roots. Yet the Brehons endured. Even into the 15th and 16th centuries, many Gaelic clans still employed hereditary Brehon families, just as they had done for centuries. These families memorized thousands of lines of legal verse, passed down through generations. They were walking libraries in a world where literacy was rare and printing presses non-existent. But pressure mounted from more than just the Crown. The Reformation brought with it a religious dimension. As Ireland resisted English Protestantism, the Crown began to see native traditions, including law, as tools of rebellion and Catholic resilience. It was no longer just about barbaric customs, it was about loyalty to empire and God. The decisive blow came in the 16th and early 17th centuries, during the Tudor conquest of Ireland. This era saw military campaigns, forced plantations, and systematic efforts to eliminate Gaelic governance structures. Brehons were increasingly excluded from positions of power. Their rulings were no longer recognized by the Crown. Some were imprisoned, others were exiled. a few quietly continued serving their communities unofficially. In 1603, the 9 Years' War ended with the defeat of the Gaelic lords, and the flight of the earls soon followed. With their departure, the traditional patronage system that supported poets, bards, and brehons collapsed. The cultural backbone of Gaelic Ireland was snapped. What followed was the plantation system, in which English and Scottish settlers replaced native landholders. English common law became mandatory and the Brehon tradition was outlawed entirely. It wasn't merely a legal shift, it was a cultural extinction event. From memory to manuscript, the last of the Brehon. Yet even in the face of erasure, something remarkable happened. Instead of vanishing completely, the Brehon tradition turned to ink. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Irish scholars, some of the last who still held knowledge of the Brehon texts, began compiling manuscripts. These included Senchus Mór, Bretha Némed, Uraikesht Beck, and others, painstakingly copied in Irish script, annotated in Latin, and hidden in monasteries and scholar families' homes. Why did they do it? Perhaps they knew the tradition's days were numbered. By preserving it on vellum and paper, they gave it a chance to survive, even if only as echo. These texts were not easy reading. They were poetic, obscure, and heavily abbreviated, designed to be interpreted by oral scholars, not casual readers. But they formed the core of what historians now call Brehon law. Without these manuscripts, we would know almost nothing about Ireland's original justice system. One such scholar was Dubhaltach mac Furbisay, a 17th century historian who dedicated his life to copying genealogies and law tracts. His efforts, and those of others, formed a kind of cultural time capsule. They didn't stop the decline, but they preserved memory. Although the Brehon system officially disappeared, some of its spirit remains embedded in Irish thinking today. Restorative justice, modern restorative justice practices which focus on compensation, healing, and community involvement, bear striking similarities to Brehon principles. In fact, some Irish mediators have cited ancient laws as inspiration. The old emphasis on public honour, social restitution, and non-violence still colours how small communities in Ireland handle disputes informally. Even as late as the 19th century, some rural communities maintained customs that bore echoes of older laws, ritual apologies, meal-based settlements, and land use debates resolved by local elders. It's also worth noting that when Ireland gained independence in the 20th century, debates emerged about how much native tradition should influence its new legal system. Ultimately, British legal structures remained dominant, but the conversation itself showed that the Brehons weren't entirely forgotten. There is something deeply calming, perhaps even comforting, in the knowledge that a legal system once existed where satirical verse could carry the weight of a court summons. Compensation mattered more than vengeance. Law was not something done to people, but with them. Silence and memory were as important as ink and power. No dungeons, no executioners, no walls of stone, just people, cattle, honour, apology, and verse. But for its time, and perhaps even for ours, it offers a compelling idea that justice can be local, humane, and wrapped in the rhythms of daily life. Tonight you've listened to laws carried not in courthouses but on the wind, spoken beneath trees, murmured in meadows, handed down at hearths. Laws where insult was met with apology, and wrongs were healed with cows, cloaks, or poetry. The Brehon Code reminds us that the boring details of life, who owns a goat, how to greet a guest, whether mead is too watery, are the very fabric of civilization. Perhaps that's what makes it all so sleep-worthy, not because it's dull, but because it's gentle, a law without harshness, a justice without prisons, a history not of wars but of walking with your neighbor until the balance was restored. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of boring story worth remembering.